Hello and welcome to the Current History Podcast. Today I'm joined by Santiago Crujeres, a public policy scholar, former Mexican Deputy Minister for Environment and Sustainable Energy, and one of the most experienced voices at the intersection of energy policy, democratization, and multilateral diplomacy. We'll be talking about Mexico's energy transition, what it actually takes to get countries to cooperate at the G20 level, the state of democracy in Latin America, a quarter century, 21st century, and why good policy so often fails in implementation and what to do about it. So this will be a bit of a change of pace, a bit of a hybrid of several different subjects. So with that, let's dive in. Santiago Crujeres is a distinguished expert and scholar in public policy and sustainable development. He served as Deputy Minister for the Environment and Sustainable Energy of Mexico and as a senior advisor to the Mexican Chamber of Deputies on Sustainability and the Environment. Internationally, he chaired the International Partnership for Energy Efficiency Cooperation, elected unanimously by all member countries, and co-led the G20 Energy Efficiency and Energy Transitions Finance Working Group. He has also held senior consultant positions at the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, the International Energy Agency, and the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. He holds 3 master's degrees from Harvard, where he is a JFK Fellow at the Kennedy School, a visiting scholar at the Weatherhead Center, and senior fellow at the Ash Center. His current research revisits Mexico's democratization process, first examined 25 years ago, and evaluates what has changed and what has backslid across Latin America since. So Santiago, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you very much, Ken, for inviting me to participate in your podcast. I'm really grateful for this opportunity and happy to chat with you about some of the things that you have just mentioned. And thank you for being very kind with sharing some of my background.
No problem. And again, thanks for joining. So your career spans government, academia, and international institutions across Mexico, Harvard, the G20, and the World Bank. And you've spent 25 years at the intersection of energy, sustainability, and democratic governments. So what drew you to this sort of cross-disciplinary approach? And for you, what's the thread that runs through all of it for you?
Well, thank you for asking me this question, because I guess that's what has actually built me as a person. You know, this idea of serving in the government, of being in academia, being exposed to international institutions, to multilateralism, has given me the opportunity to think about many things in different ways. There was this professor at the Kennedy School whose name is Mark Moore, who wrote a book about creating public value. In this book, he tries to build what he calls the strategic triangle, right? About creating public value, in which you don't just focus on the main objectives and mission and vision and goals, but you also keep in mind other things, right? In what he calls the triangle, in which on one side you also have the importance of political relationships, the importance of regulation, and on the other side you have the resources, right? You have like the IT resources, you have the infrastructure, you have the human resources, which I guess is part of the most important things that you need in terms of creating public value. And in addition to that, you have the financial resources. So all of these, right, are the elements that actually create public value. These teachings that I got from Professor Mark Moore at the time induced me to be more thoughtful and think about how this value creation should become more sustainable. So when we talk about sustainability, we need to add the idea of thinking about the social aspects. We need to think about the economic aspects, and we need to think about the environment, right? And we need to think about the value creation, not in a static way, but in a dynamic way. So this idea of sustainable value creation and this thread across government, academia, and international institutions have allowed me to be more thoughtful in terms of how public policy actually gets implemented in complex systems, because complex systems do not necessarily have like a very specific way of doing things or an answer to solving these problems, right? And that's something I also learned throughout my professional life. Sometimes we think that complex and complicated are the same thing, right? But public policy tends to be very, very, very complex, right? Because you don't really have the answer to solve a problem. You need to work on it. You need to iterate different possible solutions until you develop a path that might be useful and that might allow you to develop the answer to this complex problem and to be more resourceful in the way you can solve it. So the common thread in my work has been institution building and keeping in mind how societies design and implement policies that deliver sustainable development in practice.
Speaking of that, I wanted to dive into a specific area where you had actual experience and responsibility, which was assisting in the energy transition in Mexico. And so I was hoping to discuss, the state of play for Mexico's energy sector. And, Mexico specifically sits on enormous fossil fuel resources and also has tremendous potential for renewables. But my understanding is under recent administrations, the political winds have shifted, and at times this has been away from investment in renewables. And from your experience as deputy minister, what is the honest state of Mexico's energy transition? And your view, what's working, what is stalled, and what are the barriers that are hardest to overcome?
Well, let me go back to the moment in which I had the opportunity to start a career in the energy sector. At the time, once I had the opportunity to complete my studies at Harvard University, I had a classmate who happened to be the president of Mexico later. Felipe Calderón was my classmate, and one of his areas of expertise, one of the areas in which he really wanted to work on was the Department of Energy. So before he actually became president of Mexico, he became the Secretary of Energy. He became the Minister of Energy. So when his administration started, I started working at the office of the president. He invited me to join him and the rest of the team to work there. And at some point in time, I was assigned to become an advisor to the current secretary at the time. And one of the ideas that the president had at the time was the importance of diversifying the energy matrix in Mexico and becoming one of the leading countries in terms of developing energy transitions, not only for Mexico, but for also the rest of the world. And we embraced this mandate in a very, very professional way. As you know, Ken, Mexico has a unique energy profile. Mexico has significant fossil fuel resources, and not many people knew at the time, and I personally didn't know that well at the time, that we also had an extraordinary renewable potential. Why? Because Mexico has a lot of solar capacity, has a lot of wind capacity, and also has a lot of other renewable energies that can be developed, like water, like geothermal. Mexico is one of those few countries. At the beginning, the transition was not just technical, it was also deeply political and institutional, and having this this framework I shared a few minutes ago in my mind allowed me to see some of these things that not everyone was looking into. And as you can imagine, when you are in a department in which their history of design, implementation, and public policy innovation has always been focused on fossil fuels, it's really hard to come up with ideas on energy transitions. This is something completely new. And when you have to develop a new stakeholder or new stakeholders in the market, sort of say, in which you only had the stakeholders of the fossil fuel sector, and you need to bring in the new stakeholders of the solar sector, and you have new stakeholders of the water sector, and you have new stakeholders of the wind sector, and geothermal, and nuclear, and all that, right? And energy efficiency. So there's a lot of uncertainty in many ways. You have a lot of regulatory uncertainties. You have a lot of institutional capacity constraints. You have a lot of questions in regards to whether things will be able to be done with the private sector or not. At least in a country like Mexico, fossil fuel development is only assigned, or it was only assigned at the time, to the government, right? So Pemex was the only company in Mexico that could actually do fossil fuels digging and development, whereas in other countries, the business as usual is that the private sector can jump in and they can own all of the fossil fuels in the land they own, and so on and so forth. In Mexico, it's different, right? If you own a piece of land, right, and you want to dig in and you find oil, the oil doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the country. It belongs to the people of Mexico. So it's a whole different story, and that really required a lot of adjustments. The key challenge, I guess, at the time was to find a balanced model that ensured that energy security moved forward, and at the same time, based on the sustainability perspective, also a model that accelerated decarbonization and also considered the importance of the social aspects. Well, we were innovative in terms of developing these new policies. We cited in many ways to the multilateral organizations like the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, the Asian Development Bank, the International Energy Agency, and many others who were really willing to become innovative in terms of doing this. And Mexico was one of the champion countries.
I wanted to move on and talk a bit about your experience dealing with this process on the international stage and through your chairmanship of the IPEC and the leadership in the G20 Energy Transition Group. And what I was curious about first is what, from this process you had in Mexico specifically, what lessons did you learn from that you were able to pull out and apply to your work on the international stage?
Of course, and this was really interesting because, as I said, it was not easy to bring the energy transition to the table, and obviously when you have this idea of coming with something really new to your country, and people are used to doing things just for the fossil fuels part, it's not an easy task, and even convincing Congress to allocate budget for this is not easy. It's not easy at all. So I guess that the fact that the international organizations were also exploring this, became an opportunity and became also a partnership in terms of we could implement, not just implement, we could actually design from the very beginning many of these things because they were new. They were not only new for Mexico, they were new for many countries. And that was an opportunity of starting a trial and error policy in different ways. And at the time when we started this, the group of 20 that included most of the important economies of the world together, and that started delivering in a faster way than the United Nations, because it sort of went around the bureaucracy of the United Nations, having the country leaders, the ministers of finance, and the ministers of foreign affairs agreeing on many things. And we started working on projects that could be piloted, that could be tested, and we had the support of these different partnerships. And at some point, we agreed that energy efficiency was the cheapest energy, as we all know, right? The energy that you don't need to consume tends to be the cheapest. So we agreed on this idea of energy efficiency first. And I remember that one of the first major projects that we started focusing on was the exchange of refrigerators, the exchange of air conditioning systems, because that's something that people didn't really know that it was important. And even, well, at least at the personal level, the fact that we created a program in which we had a financial component, and that's I guess something we try to work on every single energy transition project we have in Mexico and abroad, and social behavior component, right? So it was important that we had an assessment of the situation to get started with, as in every policy project. Where were we starting from? What was our starting point? And what is it that we wanted to achieve? So that was the initial component of the project. The second one was, how are we going to pay for it, right? Because sometimes you can be very good at designing a project, and if you don't think about how to finance it, then you cannot do anything with it, right? But most of these projects require a change of behavior. So if you don't change your behavior once you are implementing it, things are going to be the same, right? If in your case, Ken, let's say that you change your air conditioning today, right? And 7 years from now, you forget about the idea that you have to be up to the best technology, even if you are like trying to keep it well maintained and clean and so on and so forth. It's going to be really expensive for you to pay for your energy bills. So you need to change your mindset, and you need to make sure that once things are moving forward, technology is evolving and developing and becoming more efficient, you need to change some of these things, right? And you need to change your behavior. And once you start like adding more energy efficiency to your life, you realize that, okay, it is not just the air conditioning. It also has to do with my refrigerator. It has to do with my stove. It has to do with the boiler for heating the water for taking a shower. It has to do with the many other things. Your car itself, right? So you need to change your mindset. You need to change your behavior. You need to change your family behavior. Even if we looked at this from the perspective of our professional life, right? Not just our personal life. If we were like changing let's say that we owned a small supermarket, right? And we had the refrigerators for the supermarket. Maybe our energy bill is huge, right? And even if we get like the refrigerators for free from the soft drinks, if they are like 10 years old and they took it from another market and they gave it to us for free, we are paying an energy bill that might be 80% higher than if we actually bought them ourselves and we actually managed to get the most efficient ones. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. So going back to the beginning of this conversation in regards to the role of the multilaterals, right? They gave us the opportunity to be very, very thoughtful and insightful in terms of how we should assess the situation, in terms of how we could possibly specify which goals we wanted to achieve, and then also resourceful in terms of providing us with funding to pilot these ideas, to pilot these projects, and to see what worked, what didn't work, how we should do it, what we should change, and what we shouldn't do in terms of the project themselves. And the third part also in terms of how we could change the behavior in terms of the intervention we were doing. For example, when we were doing something with the government, right, we had to make sure that all of the government employees changed their mindset, right? Because they would be also transferring this to their families, to their friends, to their peers, in terms of like, you know, whenever you leave the office every night, you turn off your computer, you turn off the lights, right? We need to save energy, right? That's going to save people's money in the offices, right? And that's going to be useful for doing it for other things. And then once you start thinking about it, it is not just building, right? We have public hospitals, we have public schools, we have other areas in which this type of interventions related to energy transitions can be really impactful. The fact that you save a lot of money on energy, right, might allow you to have a new operating room. It might allow you to have a better UCIA unit, right? It might allow you to have a better emergency room. It might allow you to have better classrooms for the children at the school. I remember that something we came up with, it was thanks to the assessment and design of these interventions with the International Energy Agency, was the multiple effects that these type of interventions could have in people's lives. For example, if you decided to change the lighting systems in a small town that was very dark, right, and they had a lot of burglaries and problems, right, the fact that the streets were lighted with energy transition technologies allowed for the cities to become safer, right? So it's not just the effects or the impact that you had from reducing the energy consumption, but also what came up later in regards to also taking advantage of the different opportunities that you could get from implementing energy transition technologies. And the G20, IPIC, and all of these multilaterals that were very supportive at the time were really supportive, because they knew they don't implement policies. It is the countries, the ones who actually do it. So they were very useful and helpful in terms of developing the frameworks, in terms of making sure that we were working on accurate design and accurate implementation policies that were easier and faster to implement, and as well they were very, very kind in terms of funding many of these projects.
Okay. So you're very positive minded as far as the utility of these multilateral institutions and frameworks.
Well, I mean, at least at the time they were. Many things have changed in the past few years. I guess the pandemic had a huge impact in these institutions because a lot of the funding they had was redirected. And I can tell you this because I was part of projects that were going to be designed and implemented as a sustainable development expert or expert considered, if I may be one of those that were postponed or canceled because a lot of the resources, both human, both financial resources, had to be reallocated to COVID. And even though we started going to business as usual maybe 3 years ago already, or right? I guess that the multilaterals are still struggling in terms of getting many of these financial and human resources back to the areas in which they have been like trying to explore more and develop, and it's taking much longer. I guess that one of the areas that really became important right before COVID was hydrogen, for example, and nuclear, in which the energy transition should be considering those two areas as part of the diversification of the energy matrix. But the fact is that at least the multilaterals have not had the time, if I may suggest that that's one of the situations for which they have not had the opportunity to design or implement more on that. And also the financial resources and the people, they have not been able to hire more experts to get more budget for piloting these areas in which probably we were having this discussion 10 or 12 years ago, thinking about having nuclear plants in addition to being considered like really, really dangerous for communities or the people. It would have taken a lot of time for governments to design them and implement them. The average time was 7-8 years, maybe 10, 12 years ago. Now, as far as I know, you can design and implement a nuclear plant for energy generation in less than a year and a half, right? So many things have been evolving, they have changed, but you still have to work on the caution that you need to keep in mind in terms of implementing these projects. But in the end, all this information sharing, all of these best practices sharing was really good. We tried to build like principles in terms of financing, for example. I remember that one of the most valuable things at the time is that we created some financial principles within the G20 in terms of how the sustainable projects could be financed through the banks, and we actually opened this like kind of training, right? So that the people working for the banks also understood that these projects were bankable and they could be efficient and they could be supported through the different financial institutions, and not just think that any of these ideas would be useless and would not actually allow them to get their money back if they were giving them a loan.
That's interesting. And you've touched on energy efficiency a bit, and the IEA calls it the first fuel, which, as you've mentioned, it's the cheapest fuel we have. And it consistently gets less attention than supply. So, and I also know during your chairmanship of the IPCC, you worked directly with the IEA on exactly this subject. So I was curious more, why do you think that energy efficiency is so underutilized and under-discussed? And in your experience, what is it that actually can get countries to move and actually change how energy is used and encourage energy efficiency?
Yeah, yeah, that's great that we are actually talking about this, because energy efficiency is the most strategic policy, I guess, that you can design within the energy sector, because again, it's as you have just ratified a couple of minutes ago, is the first fuel, is the least expensive. It's uh, about reducing the demand, and that gives you the opportunity to do many other things.
Yep.
And the issue, when you think about this from the government perspective, energy efficiency is not a cutting ribbon kind of public sector policy. You cannot just come back the morning after and say, okay, I'm going to cut the ribbon, right? Because we changed the lighting system. People are going to go, I mean, it looks exactly the same as it was yesterday, right? So a lot of the people in politics don't really want to get into energy efficiency, because it doesn't seem to be something that the people can really see unless they look at the numbers in the budget, which is hard for the people to really get into that. But in practice, we need to focus on, from the very beginning, is on improving energy efficiency, and also thinking about being creative in terms of regulation. What standards we need to have, what building codes, what appliance regulations we have, and again, we can even come up with financial incentives so that people become more used in terms of taking advantage of these. And energy efficiency, it's something that can be integrated across the different sectors. It can be considered within industry. It can be considered in buildings. It can be considered in power systems. It can be considered in transportation. And again, personal, public, private, in academia, and it might be invisible politically, but it is really one of the fastest and most reliable ways of improving energy security and reducing our carbon emissions.
And taking that conversation about energy policy and going global, I wanted to get your thoughts on the future of governing energy on a global scale, especially since now, there's a lot shifting fast with the adoption of AI, a lot of focus on supply chains and critical minerals, more demand in developing world, and also fragmentation geopolitically and on trade. And I know you have these organizations like the IEA that were built a world that was different, more unipolar. In this landscape, what do you think about what durable, effective energy governance looks like, and what needs to change about how countries and institutions cooperate in this space?
Well, it's really clear to us, right, that the global energy landscape is becoming more complex and more fragmented, and as in many other sectors, that's not something which is atypical. At some point in time in a cycle, you usually have this complexity evolving, you have this fragmentation evolving, and then people decide that certain things go back to business as usual at some point in time. And I guess we are at that peak now, in which we are in a more complex and more fragmented energy sector, because we are still deciding what are the answers for this complexity, these complex problems that we are facing, and we see different forces shaping the dynamics of the system. As I said earlier, we need to look at it as a dynamic system, not as a static system, because things are moving in different ways, and leadership also evolves in different ways. If we had this conversation, Ken, a few years ago, I can tell you that there were countries in other parts of the world who were really reluctant in terms of having energy transitions on their energy matrix. If they were doing some of it, it was just to keep themselves within the status quo. Many of those countries are like really willing to lead in these areas, right? They have realized that energy efficiency is a huge opportunity. They have realized that energy transitions, it's a huge opportunity. Many of them do not even have access to fuel, right? They will need fuel no matter what, because unless the whole technology evolves in a very different way, and that might be the case, but it will take some time. We might still need some of that, but we can take advantage of energy efficiency, energy technologies, and energy transitions that can become leading technologies in the ways we do things. In the same way pharmaceuticals evolve, in the same way infrastructure in other aspects. This complexity requires a lot of alignment in terms of the geopolitical competition, in terms of the acceleration or disacceleration of the energy transition in some countries, whereas maybe in others it's exactly the opposite, right? They were not really willing to do anything in regards to this 10 years ago, and now they are seeing it as an opportunity. They want to become the leaders in these areas. They have realized that, if they have like very efficient AC systems, they can save a lot of energy. And when you are talking about huge countries, this can have a huge impact on their GDP as well, right? Not just as something they are producing for inside, but also as something that they might be exporting as well. We are now in a more multipolar energy system, and I guess that the International Energy Agency has been talking about it, and how it is changing and reshaping the domestic government institutions and the international institutions. But in the end, it's an area that tends to be extremely important for security reasons, right? Every country needs energy, and energy security becomes really, really important in terms of whatever development you want to think about. And it's always something that will be there, and in my perspective, you have to take advantage of every technology it's available. You have to take advantage of every opportunity that it's there for you to diversify your matrix, because the demand it's increasing, and it will be increasing. Artificial intelligence, machine learning is requiring more energy, right? So if you say, okay, I'm not gonna use the other technologies, right? When the demand is huge and the fossil fuels technologies are not good enough, you're staying behind, right? You are going to be less competitive than the rest of the world. So I guess that things will be moving forward in terms of governance with new leaders taking over. I think that there will be broader participation for emerging economies. There will be more flexible forms of cooperation in this more complex and more fragmented geopolitical landscape. There will be greater transparency in markets and supply chains. There will be more opportunities for new stakeholders jumping in. There will be new governance opportunities for state and local governments to jump in the equation, because again, the energy security is not just for the country itself. States and local governments have to pay a lot of energy bills, and if their own policy systems require more artificial intelligence and machine learning now because of whatever it's evolving, they will still have to pay for the energy bills. They will have to be thoughtful and think about more technical cooperation, more data transparency, more financing mechanisms that reduce the transition of risks, and how to make sure that they provide certainty to the different stakeholders in the energy sector.
So cooperation at all levels of government, just to deal with what's a very complex issue with a lot of different stakeholders at a lot of different levels.
And if you think about it, Ken, is not really different for what I mentioned from the very beginning. You know, the framework that I sort of tried to develop based on Mark Moore's framework in regards to public value creation, and then I sort of shifted to sustainable public value creation.
Yeah.
It's the same idea. We may have to add one more element, as Professor Daniel Allen was telling me, in this intersection of bringing democracy and democratization into the equation.
Yeah, and so taking from this, what you just mentioned about democracy and sustainable development being sort of a missing link, I know your current research at Harvard and as a fellow at the Ash Center involves revisiting Mexico's democratization process, which is also something you examined 25 years ago. And, you know, we've seen since Mexico transitioned from being a one-party country, backsliding, polarization, fragility. It kind of spilled out to the open with this battle, a week ago between the Mexican government and drug cartel in Puerto Vallarta. What do you think, in your view, does the democratic landscape in Latin America look like today compared to the optimism of the late 90s? And what's the relationship between democracy and the ability to deliver on commitments to sustainability and climate policy and energy policy?
I guess that what I did more than 25 years ago and was a different story in terms of what is happening now. During this past 25 years of the 21st century, we had like two different times. One in which democratic institutions were being built and consolidated, and then another period of time in which we had the intervention of drug trafficking lords in these democratic institutions and the government. And that has also changed the way in which the government might be making progress, in the way in which democratic institutions should have been consolidating or backsliding. The construction of these institutions has not really consolidated or even destroyed. We used to have a one-party system, at least most of the time during the past century. During these past 25 years, we have a multi-party system. We have strategic alliances every election. Some of the alliances that one would ever thought that would never have existed, in terms of having candidates and political parties that were completely the opposite to each other in the past, and they have been running together. So the representation and the participation that tended to be really, really clear in the research of what was happening in the past century and who were voting for whom. Now, it is not necessarily a period of time in which you have a very specific ideology in the political parties, and I guess that before the end of the last century, you had like more of the political equation in which some of the parties were like on the left and some on the right. Now you have a combination in which like some of the political parties now are giving you the choice of policies that are very to the right, and at the same time they are giving you other policies that are very to the left in the same political party, depending on the issue. Now, in terms of security and safety, as we have seen, it's become an issue, right? And not necessarily because of the way these drug trafficking leaders have been really attacking society. There are always gaps or spaces that exist in the government, right? And I guess that one of the things that we can see is that these spaces that were empty, that were not being covered, in which like people in countries like Mexico or other countries in Latin America or in Africa, right, has been something that drug trafficking leaders have been supporting, and they have been providing for secret hospitals. They have been providing for funding the schools in the area, funding the churches, right?
So they're basically, in a way, providing public goods like a government would.
Exactly, right? And that is something we were also looking for in our countries, to develop this social capital. But now some of this social capital has been created with the support of drug trafficking leaders. And
yeah, and I know that whole conversation on democratization that could take over, probably several podcasts. But I was wondering if you could focus in more on what you alluded to earlier, which is this tie between democratization and sustainability commitments specifically.
Well, at least at the international level, I guess that there were commitments that were supposed to be delivered in every country, and these commitments had to be sort of adopted at the state level and at the local levels. I guess that as of the Paris Agreement, this has not been really revisited. We are still in the process, and again, after COVID, many of these things have been either put off or postponed, or so I guess there's a huge opportunity in terms of this democratic decision making, of who who leads. I for example, when we went from the UN to the G20, right, as the leading organization in terms of bringing some sort of democratic decisions for the energy sector and climate to some extent, and then we landed in the Paris Agreement, in which it was the G20 and the UN working together, right? That has sort of stayed behind, right? After COVID, some of these COP events that we have every year have not necessarily become the decision-making fora that we were supposed to have. I'm questioning myself, who is supposed to lead at this point? Is it the state governments? Is it the local governments? Is it the non-profit organizations? Is it the academic institutions? I don't have the answer for that now. But as these things are evolving, I think that in terms of this reorganization, in this realignment of the sustainability sector, if you want to name it, in one way, and how you can like make decisions within it, both at the domestic level and at the international level and at the multilateral level, right? It's evolving in many different ways. So I guess there's a lot of stuff to be researched, a lot of stuff in terms of looking into this new complexity. Again, some of these things that had sort of become complicated for a period of time have become now complex again, and we need to figure out what's the new solution for them.
Yeah. So I want to move on to our closing topic. You teach the courses Getting Things Done and Implementing Public Policy at Harvard. So after 25 years in public service, what do you see as the most common and most underappreciated reasons that well-designed policy can fail in the real world?
Well, they work together in many different ways, and we try to think about the idea of building state capabilities and developing frameworks that can become adaptive and inclusive from all of the stakeholders that sometimes you thought they were not part of the complexity of that system, and that you have to identify, and that you have to hear from, and that you have to bring into the equation in terms of having really access to different and possible solutions. So that's one of them, and building these state capabilities are necessary when you want to solve one of these problems. In addition to that, you have the different perspectives on economic growth in terms of mapping the growth of each country, of each economy, and how they are evolving, considering the different resources that you have in each country, considering the distances that you have from one country to another, depending on what you want to produce and what you want to sell. Because the fact that you have certain resources doesn't mean that it's going to be efficient for you to produce them and sell them. So these are some of the things that Ricardo would be teaching and exploring and looking at some of the platforms that he has developed, finding the solution to complexity and complex problems. It's also something that I enjoy a lot, and that I would recommend anyone who likes doing these type of things to focus on and take the opportunity to do it.
I totally agree with that, and I think it's important for readers to keep in mind that a lot of the policy research isn't really a political opinion, subjective thing. It's people trying to objectively come up with ideas to solve a specific problem, and then with specific criteria for evaluating it and implementing it. I was also wondering, to the extent you're able, if you could touch on what you see personally as the most important problems to look at when evaluating a policy and determining, whether it will succeed or fail in the implementation.
Well, that brings me back to the starting of our conversation today, Ken. Clear mission and vision and objectives and goals and metrics, but also think about the regulation. Is the regulation helping you or stopping you in terms of moving forward in this strategy that you are trying to design and implement? Are the political terms aligned at this point, or will they be aligned as you implement the policy? Is it something that you will be successful at, or are you considering that so that you can keep that alignment throughout? And then the operational capacity. Do you have the resources? Like, for example, let's say that we decided to go to whatever country and you build the best hospital with 300 beds, and then you don't have the doctors, right? Or the nurses. What's the point, right? So you need the human resources if you want to be successful in terms of, like, it's not just the infrastructure of building an acute care hospital in the middle of nowhere. Do you have the financial resources for paying these doctors, for paying for the nurses' services, for paying for the lab services? Are you considering the information technology necessary to make sure the management of whatever the system might be, it's being supportive and effective and efficient in whatever you need? I guess all that is important. And then think about the social aspects, think about the environment, think about the economic aspects, right? I remember, for example, going back to my energy experiences, right? At some point in time, we had a lot of wind to produce energy, but we also had a lot of birds, right? So many people were not happy about birds being killed with the windmills. So you have to be, very, very thoughtful about many of these things.
So it's really just consider everything holistically, and what does each aspect, how does that impact every other aspect? And I can imagine that, because, if you have this example where you're negotiating over, birds being killed by wind turbines, well, now that's a whole political issue you have to solve on top of the energy issue. So I think we've come up onto the end of our time. So I wanted to ask if you had any brief closing thoughts for our audience before we close this out.
Well, first, I would like to thank you, Ken, for inviting me to be part of your podcast. Important takeaways that I guess will be important is that democratization is not a one-time event. It's an ongoing process of building institutions, and it is important to have that in mind. And in terms of energy governance, which I guess it's the other area that we touched upon during our conversation very much, is that it again will require institutions to be more cooperative and innovative and resilient in terms of the current complex geopolitical landscape. So those are two of the things that I should mention, and I recommend everyone to keep this holistic idea of creating sustainable public value, and if necessary, with the ingredient of democracy as part of the recipe for creating sustainable public value. So again, thank you so much for this opportunity, and I really commend you for doing this podcast, and I look forward to being here again with you in the future, Ken.
Yep. Thank you, Santiago, and it's an honor to have you on this podcast as well, especially given your depth of experience to take this time to talk about energy policy and just policy in general. And so again, thank you for joining us. And also thank you for anyone listening or watching on YouTube. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Current History is also on YouTube and on Substack. On Substack, you can subscribe at current-history.com and get updates whenever a podcast or a blog post is posted. The subscription is free for now, but any support through one of the paid tier options is greatly appreciated and helps make this content possible. So again, thank you for joining in, and we'll see you next time.